sommes aujourd'hui dimanche 19 juin 1994, et il est 16h22 à Kigali, dans le blindé de la RTLM. Avis à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, oui, à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous, les Guinéens, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais.
abatwumva ko nyine abantu bose bahagurukiye kurwanya inyenzi inkotanyi n'ababwiye abasirikare bacu nibo ba mbere mbabwira urubyiruko rwagutse kugira ngo bafashe abasirikare bacu mbabwira inkumi mbabwira abasore murabyumva rero inyenzi ntabwo zishobora gukandira abantu bose
imana tugira iwacu nuko ari bake cyane
ni bake cyane ndetse nubwo twabariraga ku ijana icumi ku ijana ubwo basigara 8 ku ijana abantu se koko
muze twishime nshuti inkotanyi zashize muze twishime nshuti yewe imana ntirenganya.
On April 6, 1994, the Rwandan Genocide officially began. Over the course of the following months, over 800,000 Rwandans were killed by their own neighbors, friends, and families. The recording you have just heard is one of the many broadcast by the interim government encouraging this open violence. Often known as the Forgotten Genocide, the world stood idly by while men, women, and children were murdered in the streets. The genocide began when then-President Juvenal Haramba was assassinated after his plane was shot down over the capital city of Kigali. This occurred the day after he signed the controversial Arusha Accords, which created an official ceasefire to the Rwandan Civil War. This was between the Rwandan government and the RPF, or Rwandan Patriotic Front. The Tutsi-supported RPF claimed the crash was orchestrated by Hutu militants within the government who were against the ceasefire, while the Hutu population accused the RPF and Tutsis of committing the assassination. The Hutu and Tutsis were the two major ethnic groups in the country. Through all of this bloodshed, the rest of the world stood frozen, unsure what to do. Nations such as the US chose to remain neutral as they had no economic interest in the region. Meanwhile, the countries of the UN debated amongst themselves on whether or not to deploy troops to the area. Belgium, Canada, and France chose to deploy soldiers in the area. However, the latter of which has been accused of perpetrating the genocide to further their own interests. Meanwhile, Canada has been criticized for remaining willfully blind to the direty of the situation, despite warnings from within their own ranks. Canadian Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire was initially deployed in Rwanda as an observer of the situation in 1993. During his tour, he noted several signs that tension was escalating in the area. Several high-ranking politicians were murdered at random. The nation's radio stations were producing anti-Tutsi propaganda, and the country became flooded with French weapons through supply shipments. Despite these signs of escalating tension, the Canadian government refused to deploy more resources in the area. With a contingent of only 2,500 soldiers and the remnants of the RPF, Dallaire was able to evacuate over 400,000 refugees into the surrounding region of Zaire. However, this was only a fraction of the amount of people that still remained in the country. During the next month, Hutu extremists exacted violent attacks on Tutsi civilians. A UN mandate at the time stated that force is only to be used when a personnel is in immediate danger. This left Dallaire and his men unable to stop the horrors that were in front of them. Despite Dallaire's best efforts, the killings continued without an end in sight. On a near-daily basis, Dallaire placed requests for assistance in the form of soldiers and ammunition. However, these went unheeded. It was also during this time, Resolution 912 was enacted by the UN, with the stated goals of reaffirming previous resolutions and working towards peace in the area. The resolution failed in these goals. Part of this enactment resulted in the withdrawal of 90% of Dallaire's soldiers, leaving behind simply 251 trained operatives. This was woefully insufficient to prevent the mass wave of violence occurring. It resulted in Dallaire being forced to make the difficult decision of placing his men in direct danger if they no longer had the support to keep them safe.
But with the force I had, there was no way that I could open fire and guarantee the security of my force. I didn't have enough ammunition to be able to hold out in a firefight for more than half an hour.
During this time, the UN was embroiled in a grudge match between nations. Issues such as who would pay for the bill and who would send troops resulted in the aid being sent to the country being delayed. However, on May 21st, almost an entire month after the UN force in the area was removed, 6,800 UN peacekeepers from the surrounding area were deployed. In spite of this, the UN and US refused to classify the ongoing conflict as a genocide. Canada did not object to sending soldiers to the area. However, concerns still remained about the financial responsibility. It was also during this time Canada had soldiers deployed in Croatia, Somalia, and Haiti, meaning that the forces were already spread fairly thin. As a result, many of the Canadian soldiers deployed were inexperienced and not prepared for the harshness of the conflict. While aid was slowly starting to pour into the country, the RPF started to push their way into the capital city of Kigali. Despite having a force of only 20,000 in relation to the estimated 36,000 Hutu militants, the RPF forces were far more organized, and with the addition of UN forces, began making significant inroads. France, seeing this advancement, began deploying their forces in the south of the country and establishing safe zones in the surrounding area. Known as Operation Turquoise, this may have caused more damage and allowed the genocide to continue for a longer period of time. The Hutu population in Rwanda felt a strong allegiance to France, and vice versa. This attachment extends back to the initial colonization of Rwanda during the 1600s. It therefore be in France's best interest to have a Hutu state rather than a Tutsi. Looking at France's actions with this in mind, the actions become far more sinister. The weapons delivered into the country prior to the genocide were French. France was opposed to sending peacekeepers to the area, and finally, the safe zones established protected the very people committing the genocide, while allowing said genocide to continue within the safe zones. In spite of France's actions, the advancements made by the UN-supported RPF proved far too great for the opposition. Within the coming weeks, the orchestrators of the genocide would have either fled the country or been captured. At last, some semblance of peace had been restored to the land. In the aftermath of the genocide, a country fell into shambles. Countless innocents were dead, and many more were scared for life. One of those in the latter group was Romeo Dallaire. Despite his best efforts in saving countless lives, he still felt guilt for the lives he could not save, and suffered from PTSD for years after leaving the country. However, after seeking treatment, he has gone on to write 2 bestsellers about his experience, and also went on to serve the Senate, being a staunch supporter of various humanitarian missions. The UN was heavily criticized for their lack of action in the face of this atrocity. UN head Kofi Annan publicly apologized for such a mere 2 years after the genocide occurred.
All of us. It was our collective failure. The list I have given you, we all failed Rwanda. There was lack of political will, not the lack of information.
The policies of the UN were significantly altered after this failure. Peacekeepers were given the ability to use their weapons in situations not affecting their safety, and communication between nations has been stressed. These mandates are still in effect to this day. Despite occurring over 20 years ago, the impact of the genocide still persists today. Many of the ringleaders who planned the genocide fled into neighboring regions and later to other areas around the world. In Canada alone, there are over a dozen high-ranking Hutu leaders who fled the country. Jean Bosco Mutenga leads the Rwandan Genocide Tribunal and is working towards extraditing these criminals. He has described the Canadian government as being slow but cooperative, the first of which is stressed, as many are still awaiting trials, and in May of 2016, the last of which, Leo Mugesera, was deported to Rwanda and is currently serving life imprisonment for giving speeches that incited the violence. While it is true that Canada's actions during the Rwandan genocide were not entirely unlike other countries, some specific details make Canada's especially egregious. First and foremost, Canada was made well aware of the escalating conflict in the region before any other country in the UN, but despite this took no extra precautions. Secondly, when Resolution 912 was enacted, Canada deployed part of their forces to other conflicts such as Bosnia and Haiti. This resulted in the remaining force being unable to prevent further bloodshed. When soldiers were sent in once again, many were inexperienced and had little to no boots-on-the-ground experience. Even after the genocide had ceased, Canada still inadvertently harbored many of the perpetrators of the genocide when allowing refugees into the country. Through Canada's lack of action, the reputation of being the world's peacekeeper was drawn into question. The next major conflict Canada would enter would be in Afghanistan. However, instead of being peacekeepers, they acted as a military force. Canada officially apologized for their actions during the genocide in 2007. Governor General Michel Jean stated that the genocide was brought on by indifference and inaction of the international community. Canada acknowledges and accepts responsibility of this international community. I believe we could have made a difference. I believe we could have reduced the magnitude of the genocide. Today, Rwanda has become a thriving country, with the capital city of Kigali becoming a bustling metropolis. However, the scars of the genocide would forever remain. During the summer of 1994, 1 in 10 Rwandans lost their life. While it is important to try to move forward and make amends, it is also important to never forget what happened. From the genocide, we could take away the idea that we as a species have to rely on each other for aid, and it is important to confront problems rather than let them fester. Today, a single phrase is used when discussing the genocide: never again. This simple phrase is put on shirts, posters, and recited by politicians. However, this is simply not the case. Tragedies such as this would in fact occur again. The only difference is whether we respond, and whether we do it before it is too late.